Grand Arbiter Vex had presided over 400 years of Galactic Council sessions without once losing his composure. The glass spire on Council Prime was designed for that. Crystalline silence, gravity adjusted to the precise comfort of the 11 founding species, bioluminescent murals cycling through 2 millennia of diplomatic triumphs. It was a place built to make everyone feel that the universe was, on balance, manageable. The hologram currently floating above the chamber floor was making Vex reconsider that belief. The human woman on the projection wore a gray suit with the precision of someone who had decided once how she would dress for war and had never changed her mind. Salt and pepper hair pulled back, a physical document resting on the table in front of her, its cover stamped with the seal of the United Nations Colonial Administration. Admiral Thorne set one finger on the document and did not move it. Vex's primary and secondary sets of eyes both tracked the gesture. He had learned, in the 3 months since the Council's Budget Committee had circulated the Contracted Security Initiative proposal, to watch human hands. The Budget Committee's case had been simple. The hegemony's outer sectors were a security drain. Patrols cost fuel. Fuel cost credits. Credits were finite. The Katak-Val border conflict had entered its 19th year. Piracy along the Oros corridor had tripled, and the Council's internal polling showed that 42% of member species considered personal safety their primary concern, up from 11% the previous decade. The committee needed a cheaper option. The humans had submitted a bid. It was, by a significant margin, the lowest. Councillor Drath of the Vel Consortium had introduced the footage during the preliminary review. A human soldier, recorded on a frontier outpost, consuming what the attached nutritional analysis identified as a caffeine-infused nutrient bar. The caffeine concentration alone would have induced fatal cardiac events in 90% of the species currently seated in the chamber. The soldier had eaten 3 in sequence while conducting weapons maintenance. Drath had argued this was relevant data. The committee agreed that it was, at minimum, data. Vex had reviewed the human's military history on the flight to the session. He had stopped at the Second World War entry and spent the remainder of the journey staring at the bulkhead. Thorne's voice carried through the holographic link with the flat warmth of someone who had already won and was being courteous about it. The Universal Peacekeeping Charter is a straightforward document, Counselor, 3,200 pages, but the operative section is 3 paragraphs. Section 8, Expenditure and Salvage, governs compensation. Section 11, Liability and Indemnity, governs outcomes. Everything else is formatting. Vex's feathers flared. An involuntary bioluminescent response, pale gold, the color of institutional unease. You have not reviewed the ethics and conduct provisions, Admiral. Thorne's finger moved 1 millimeter on the document's cover. We are a chartered corporate entity, Arbiter. Ethics provisions apply to sovereign military forces. We are contractors. The applicable framework is commercial law. A pause that lasted exactly as long as she intended it to. You will find it on page 2107. The stamp came down, heavy, mechanical, industrial, and the session's audio log captured it as a period at the end of a very long sentence. The first human peacekeeping cruiser to enter Council-adjacent space was a refitted ore freighter called the Unca Reasonable Compromise. It had been painted gunmetal gray and fitted with enough railgun emplacements that the sensor arrays at Oros Station spent 6 minutes attempting to classify it before defaulting to heavy escort, probable. Sergeant McCready, embedded with the forward logistics team, was in the engine bay when the first Council inspector came aboard. The inspector, a Vel technician with 4 sensor palps and an expression of profound professional suffering, held up his credentials and stared at the railgun capacitor banks. They were the size of cargo containers. His palps rotated toward McCready with the slow, deliberate movement of a man who wants a specific answer before he writes his report. McCready wiped his hands on a rag that was more carbon scoring than fabric. He looked at the inspector, then at the capacitors, then back with the patience of a man who has explained things to people who didn't want to understand them many times before. Navigational safety systems, point-to-point kinetic deterrence. For asteroids, the inspector's palps completed their rotation. Those are 12-centimeter railgun bores. Big asteroids. The first real test came at Oros. The Katak and Val fleets had been exchanging fire across the gas giant's equatorial band for 11 days, when the reasonable compromise dropped out of FTL directly between them, followed by 6 more vessels, equally ambiguous in classification, and a logistics platform the size of a sports stadium that the manifest identified as neutral economic interest. Mobile Refinery Unit 7. The Katak fired a warning shot. McCready's voice came up from the sensor bay, calm, with the slight distraction of a man doing 3 other things simultaneously. "Sir, they aren't firing back. They're serving us with a summons for spatial trespassing and have already towed our fuel tankers." Thorne, via relay from the UNCA Equitable Resolution 3 light minutes out, did not look up from the document she was annotating. File the property damage lien for the warning shot. Calculate replacement cost plus hazard premium. Tow the Katak flagship as collateral for outstanding debt. Standard rate. Both fleets were consulting their own legal advisors before the summons had finished formatting. The human legal software required to process the filing was not configured for the Council's communication network and could not be refused transmission. The joint liability agreement was signed 11 hours later. The UNCA received 10% of annual GDP from both signatories, retroactive to the first shot fired, which under Section 8 made the entire 19-year conflict a billable peacekeeping engagement. The pirate fleet that tested the Oros safety fence 3 weeks later was faster about it. Captain Miller was on his 3rd cup of coffee, brewed in the sensor bay of the UNCA Equitable Resolution, technically not approved by the atmospheric recyclers but technically not prohibited either, when the proximity alert came up. 22 ships, no transponders, engine signatures consistent with modified Vel Raider-class hulls, approaching from the dark side of the fence. Miller looked at the alert. He looked at his coffee. He pulled up the maintenance log for the DMZ safety drone network, found a scheduled server maintenance window that he typed in, backdated by 6 minutes, and saved. The drones did not know about the maintenance window. The drones knew about unauthorized engine signatures within the exclusion perimeter. They assisted the pirate fleet with great precision. The debris field was still expanding when Miller completed the incident report, noting that the pirates had vandalized designated safety infrastructure with their vessel hulls. His voice carried the level administrative calm of a man narrating something that had nothing to do with him. "It's not an act of war, Captain. It's an automated safety malfunction. My technicians are at lunch." The Council emergency session that followed was VEX's 43rd of the year. Evidence was presented that humanity had stabilized 3 sectors, but 40% of the trade routes in those sectors now required a human safety inspection fee. The Interstellar Communications Hub, Galactic Nervous System, 12,000 years of civilization's backbone, had been reclassified as a human cultural heritage site on a Tuesday. The filing had been submitted during a council recess. Janitorial crews arrived on Wednesday. They were large, wore UNCA patches, and carried equipment that the hub's original architects would have recognized as military-grade signal intelligence hardware, wearing the aesthetic of a mop. Thorne's hologram in the emergency session was, as always, slightly more vivid than anyone else's in the chamber. She had never explained why. One hand rested on the safety manual in front of her, steady and unhurried. "You can fire us, certainly." Her voice carried without effort. "But per the contract, we keep the hub, and the moons, and the janitorial rights." VEX's bioluminescence had gone the color of old ash. Across the chamber, 3 council members were quietly reading their communication service agreements, new documents, added to the hub's user interface during Wednesday's cleaning shift. The roaming fee for council government signals transiting through hub infrastructure was on page 912. It was not a large fee. It was the kind of fee that accumulated. Outside, in the dark between stars, a navigation buoy blinked at the steady interval of something that does not sleep and does not lose patience. The hub's signal traffic passed through it on the way to everywhere. Every packet, every message, every council directive transmitted into space on frequencies that now ran through human infrastructure. The meter was already running. The Council's Legal Constraints Committee met for 11 hours before producing Resolution 77C, a formal prohibition on the use of offensive explosive ordnance by UNCA contractors operating within Council-recognized space. Vex had signed it with the specific satisfaction of a man who has finally found the right wall to put up. The resolution was transmitted to Admiral Thorne at 0300 Council Prime Standard. Her reply arrived at 0317. Acknowledged. UNCA forces would immediately suspend all use of offensive explosive ordnance. Adjusting operational doctrine accordingly. Please see attached equipment manifest for the Oros sector refit. The manifest was 4 pages. The relevant line was on page 2. Kinetic deterrence payload. Tungsten alloy safety weights. 50 metric tons. Unpowered. Non-explosive. McCready was in the fabrication bay of the UNCA pragmatic option when the council inspector arrived for the compliance review. Inspector Zeleth, senior technician from the Non-Proliferation Audit Division, had reviewed 14 years of weapons systems documentation and considered herself difficult to surprise. She was looking at the object in the fabrication cradle, roughly 4 meters long, tungsten dark, machined to tolerances that implied someone had spent serious money on it. No guidance fins, no propulsion system, no payload cavity. McCready set down his calibration tool and crossed his arms with the patient authority of a man whose expertise was not in question. Navigational hazard weight. For safety, you deploy it in a high-traffic area. Ships have to maneuver around it. Encourages defensive flying. Zeleth's sensor cluster rotated toward the deployment rack, which held 47 of them, and if a ship fails to maneuver around it, their collision avoidance systems have failed. McCready picked up his calibration tool again. Tragic. We file a report. At the rebel moon of Tyrith 9, a fortified installation belonging to the Kel sovereignty had been causing what the UNCA incident logs described as navigational irregularities for 6 weeks. The UNCA pragmatic option conducted a safety weight deployment exercise at 1400 hours. The Kel Sovereignty's ground installation ceased transmitting at 1403. McCready completed the incident report with the focused calm of a man filing a tax return, not looking up from the data slate when Zeleth entered the bay behind him. It's not a missile, Inspector. His stylus moved across the slate. It's an unpowered safety weight. The fact that it hit their capital ship is a tragic failure of their collision avoidance systems. Zeleth reviewed the sensor footage. The safety weight had achieved terminal velocity consistent with a low-yield nuclear device. There had been no chemical reaction, no payload. The Council's non-proliferation statute defined prohibited weapons by the presence of a chemical or nuclear reaction. Her report took 3 days to write. Its conclusion was compliant. The air in the bay smelled of hot metal and ozone from the fabrication equipment, the residual warmth of something that had been moving very fast not long ago. The peace dinner on Vel Station was Thorne's idea. The diplomatic record would later note this as a warning sign that should have been heeded. Human traditional appetizers arrived first, listed on the manifest as cultural exchange foodstuffs. Standard preparation. The Zarathi delegation's chief medical officer, reviewing the list after the fact, identified capsaicin concentrations 1,700 times above the Zarathi pain threshold, ethanol at levels consistent with industrial solvent, and a substance labeled hot sauce, extra, that did not correspond to any compound in the Galactic Council's chemical database. The Zarathi delegation's table lasted 4 minutes. 3 of the delegates required emergency medical intervention. The 4th was found sitting very still against the far wall, apparently reconsidering something. The UNCA's biological hazard response team was, with suspicious efficiency, already suited up in the corridor outside. Thorne appeared via hologram from the Equitable Resolution, her expression carrying the calibrated concern of someone who has been informed of a problem that is also a solution. She watched the response teams move in and did not rush them. Mandatory quarantine zone, biological hazard, category undetermined. Trade routes through this sector will require human safety escorts pending investigation. The investigation was assigned to a UNCA subcommittee. The subcommittee's first meeting was scheduled for 8 months later. The warlord Kethvar received his insurance adjuster on a Tuesday. The adjuster, Clark, wore a tactical suit and carried a data slate and had the practiced friendliness of someone whose entire professional life was a negotiation. Kethvar's fleet was 12 ships. He had built it over 20 years. By Outer Rim standards, it was impressive. Clark studied the reactor shielding on the lead vessel for approximately 90 seconds. His stylus moved across the data slate with the unhurried certainty of a man filling out a form he has filled out many times before. Look, you have a beautiful fleet. It would be a shame if a peacekeeping malfunction happened and your coverage didn't pay out. Kethvar's fleet was towed while he was still reviewing the third page of the safety waiver. The impound lot was the size of a moon. His application for release was number 4012 in the queue. Processing time was estimated at 3 to 5 standard years. A human carrier group drifted into the Council Treasury system on what its navigation log described as a GPS calibration fault. Deeply sorry, initiating repairs. The repair process took 6 days. During those 6 days, the carrier group's sensor arrays, passive mode, stellar navigation recalibration, the logs were careful about this, mapped every quantum lock configuration on the Treasury Vault's outer ring. The vault was very cold, the structural temperature of something that has never expected to be looked at from the outside. When the carrier group departed, they left a small drone behind. The log listed it as navigation beacon, standard issue, inadvertent deployment, non-recoverable. The drone transmitted on frequencies the Council's security division had not known existed. 3 weeks later, a UNCA signals team delivered a safety audit report to the Council's Security Directorate, helpfully pointing out the frequencies as a vulnerability they might want to address. The report was 300 pages. The Council inspectors who arrived at Recycling Plant Alpha were expecting a violation. They found a UNCA facility manager named Okafor, a cup of something that smelled like coffee but wasn't, and a tour. The processing floors were the size of city blocks. Structures the inspectors' passive sensors classified as capital ship hull sections lined the walls in various states of assembly. Okafor led the tour at a comfortable pace, the cup in one hand, the expression of a man who has given this tour before and has decided he enjoys it. Peaceful debris storage units, Okafor gestured broadly. Council Resolution 84, mandatory salvage compliance. We collect debris from active conflict zones, process it for reuse. Green Initiative, protected under environmental statute. The lead inspector's report noted that when the debris storage units departed for their safety drill, they were fully crewed, fully armed, and their power signatures were consistent with combat-ready capital ships. 17 of them in formation, moving with the absolute unhurried certainty of ships that know exactly where they are going. The inspector's recommendation was, regulation unclear, further review required. The review was assigned a timeline of 8 months. The fleet had been given a name before the first month concluded. It was called the Forward Safety Element. It had its own flag. The planet Velketh was 3 weeks from starvation when it received its third automated notice from the UNCA Safety Navigation Authority. The first notice had arrived when the planetary government refused to pay what it described as an illegal occupancy fee for the navigation buoys that had appeared without announcement in their primary shipping lanes. The buoys were small and blinking, connected by faint lighter grids, and they had very polite automated voices that explained, in 11 languages, with the patient repetition of something that does not get tired, that any vessel not in possession of a current human safety escort certificate was entering a restricted zone and should stand by for assistance. The assistance cost 1,200 credits per vessel per transit. The planet's entire commercial fleet could not afford it. The medical resupply run that had been scheduled for the end of the month sat in dock on the far side of the cordon, fully loaded, going nowhere. MacReady was aboard the UNCA Persistent Resolve, parked at comfortable distance from Velketh's orbital band, running a systems diagnostic that was not urgent. An open comm channel broadcast a low-frequency audio loop. The ship's entertainment manifest listed it as recreational card game, open frequency. The sound carried the shuffle and slap of cards, the occasional low voice, someone laughing about something that had nothing to do with the planet below. A distress call came in from Velketh at hour 14. MacReady noted it in the log. At hour 19, Thorne's voice came across the command channel. Prepare the medical supply package. Standard humanitarian response. Have the deed transfer ready. MacReady set down his hand. Boss, the deed transfer is for the mining rights. Correct. To a habitable planet. 99-year lease. Standard terms. The channel held a silence with the quality of something already decided. They get the medicine, we get the subsurface. MacReady stared at the ceiling of the sensor bay for a moment. He picked up his stylus. Lie on it and leave it. The medical team arrived within 6 hours of the lease signing. Efficient, well-supplied, professional. The mining survey team arrived the following morning. Neither team acknowledged the other in the logs. The Universal Harmony Project was, on its surface, a media initiative. The Human Cultural Ministry, described more accurately in internal UNCA documentation as a sophisticated SIGINT array mapping every Secure Council frequency, launched its flagship broadcast program across 14 sectors. The title, in translation, was Galaxy's Got Talent. It ran on every accessible frequency simultaneously. There was no way to miss it. The production values were considerable. The Grell and the Zix had been at war for 500 years over a binary star system neither of them had meaningfully used in 3 centuries. The show featured representatives of both species in adjacent studio segments for 6 consecutive episodes. By episode 4, both civilizations had independently contacted the production company to demand cancellation on grounds of criminal insult to cultural dignity. By episode 6, they had formed a joint committee, which was, by any objective measure, the first cooperative act between the Grell and the Zix in recorded history. The Joint Committee issued a formal declaration of unified intent against the UNCA production company. They labeled it an act of cultural aggression. Thorne reviewed the declaration over her morning coffee. The declaration was 3 pages. She read it in the time it took to drink half the cup. File them as hostile to cultural exchange. Trigger the asset seizure clause. And pull the broadcast. We got what we needed from the SIGINT array. MacReady looked up from his data slate. The anti-riot orbital lasers? Thorne set her cup down. Restore order. The Dara hegemony was, by galactic standards, a significant power. 12 systems, a navy of considerable size. A Grand Marshal named Oren Voss, who had spent 30 years building something he was confident was unassailable. He sent a formal threat to Earth, direct, unambiguous, with coordinates and a timeline attached. He considered clarity a professional virtue. The response from Admiral Thorne arrived 6 hours later. 3 sentences. We have reviewed your communique. Please see the attached document. The attachment is Section 14B of the Universal Peacekeeping Charter, commonly referred to as the Sun Killer Clause. The stellar siphon that appeared in the Dara system 3 days later did not look like a weapon. It was enormous and quiet, a structure of considerable engineering patience, and it had begun, according to instruments the Dara hegemony's own astronomers operated, to reduce their primary star's output by a measurable fraction per hour. The reduction was consistent. It did not pause. It did not fluctuate. Orenvas demanded an explanation via emergency diplomatic channel. The stars of his home system looked the same through the viewport, but the instruments disagreed, and the instruments were not the kind of thing you argue with. Thorne appeared in the reply hologram. Her hand rested on the safety manual on the table in front of her, the contact deliberate and unhurried, a gesture that had the quality of a signature. We're not blowing up your sun. We're just downsizing its output for the environment. Orenvas's fleet surrendered 17 hours later. The instruments recorded that the star's output had dropped by 4%. The siphon could, technically, have continued indefinitely. That number, 4%, sat in the back of every calculation anyone made in that system from that moment forward, a reminder that the margin had been chosen, not reached. The Dara Hegemony's fleet was processed by the kennel within 72 hours. No one outside the UNCA's inner planning tier had known about the kennel until the moment it became necessary to reveal it. And even then, the reveal was not dramatic. It was the delivery of a logistics report to the Council's Intelligence Committee, which had been formally requesting information about salvaged vessels for 3 years and had received each time a response noting that the inquiry was under review. The report was 116 pages. The relevant data was on page 1. The kennel was a mobile Dyson ring system, presently located at coordinates classified, containing 1,012 vessels formerly belonging to 22 separate civilizations. Each vessel had been refitted. Each vessel was crewed by human-designed AI systems running on UNCA operational protocols. Each vessel was currently active. The Council's Intelligence Committee reviewed the report in silence. The chamber was cold. The temperature always ran slightly lower than the attending species preferred, a legacy of a facilities contract that had never been renegotiated, and no one moved to adjust it. One member would later describe the specific quality of that silence. It was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of a room full of people separately arriving at the same arithmetic. Humanity had not been destroying the ships it salvaged. It had been collecting them. The kennel's 1,012 vessels were out there right now, in the dark between stars, running on silent patrol routes that covered every major trade corridor in the quadrant. Not hiding, not threatening, simply present. The way a perimeter is present, the way a cage is present, depending entirely on which side of it you are standing. The committee chair set the report down on the table. The sound it made was very small. Somewhere in the report's appendices on page 97, a footnote explained that the kennel was also capable of full refit operations on captured vessels in under 72 hours. No one had gotten to page 97 yet. They didn't need to. The Grand Arbiter's resolution was 4,000 pages. Vex had commissioned it from the Council's 3 most senior legal scholars, with contributions from the Ethics and Conduct Bureau, the Non-Proliferation Division, and a specialist in historical precedent whose expertise predated the human contract by 600 years. It cited 241 specific clauses of the original Peacekeeping Charter, 12 Council resolutions, and the foundational principles of galactic law as established by the Treaty of the First Silence. It was, by every formal measure, comprehensive. Vex had read it 3 times on the night before the session. He had underlined nothing because there was nothing to underline. It was correct, thorough, and airtight, and none of that was going to matter. And he knew it, and he read it a 4th time anyway, because he was the kind of creature who finishes what he starts. The title was Resolution for the Dissolution of the UNCA Peacekeeping Mandate on Grounds of Gross Negligence, Systematic Bad Faith, and Willful Exploitation of Legal Ambiguity. Vex read it into the record himself. He stood very straight. His bioluminescence cycled through colors that no council protocol had a name for, belonging to the part of Vel physiology that activates when the body understands something the mind is still refusing to process. The chamber doors opened when he reached the closing paragraph. Admiral Thorne walked in without soldiers. She walked in with 11 humans in gray suits carrying data slates, and behind them a unit of 18 more in UNCA formal dress, who the security staff would later confirm were not carrying weapons, but were carrying, in aggregate, approximately 40,000 pages of financial documentation. The documentation arrived in physical form, printed, indexed, divided into binders of 100 pages each. Because physical documents cannot be remotely deleted, and Thorne was thorough about that kind of thing. Thorne took the floor. She did not raise her voice. She did not gesture dramatically. She set the safety manual on the table, opened it to a marked page, and looked up at Vex with the expression of someone who has been waiting for a specific conversation, and is glad it has finally arrived. "You can fire us, Arbiter." Her voice carried to every corner of the chamber without effort. "But the planet you're sitting on is currently being held as collateral by the New York Stock Exchange. We'll need you to vacate the premises by Friday." The glass spire went quiet in a way it had not been designed for. The acoustics were built for debate, for argument, for the layered harmonics of 11 species processing information simultaneously. They were not built for this specific silence, the silence of 400 years of institutional confidence discovering, in real time, that it had signed something it had not read. One of Thorne's accountants set a document in front of the nearest council member. It was the early termination invoice. The council member looked at it for a long time without moving. The figure was expressed in galactic standard credits. A handwritten notation in the margin explained that it was also expressible in star systems, 14, inhabited planets, 41, or the Council's remaining operational naval tonnage, all of it. The security line on Council Prime had been filed 17 months earlier, quietly, through a shell holding registered in the UNCA's Outer Rim Development Trust. The lien was collateral for an unpaid peacekeeping infrastructure fee that had accrued across the full duration of the contract. Section 8, page 940. The Council's own legal scholars worked through the night of the hearing confirming what they already suspected. It was uncontestable. McCready watched the session feed from the UNCA Pragmatic Options sensor bay, running a systems diagnostic on the kennel's remote management interface that he had stopped looking at approximately 6 minutes into the broadcast. He watched Vex read the resolution. He watched Thorne walk in. He watched Vex's bioluminescence go dark, not cycling, not fluctuating, but genuinely dark, the color of something that has stopped trying. McCready reached across the console and poured himself a cup of coffee. He sat back. He watched the rest of the session with the satisfaction of a man who has always known how the math was going to work out and has been willing to wait for the room to catch up. Vex accepted the terms. He did it the way someone accepts a diagnosis, not because they believe it, but because the instruments are not wrong and the time for a second opinion has passed. His bioluminescence did not return to its normal cycling while the terms were read. It stayed dark. Around him, the most powerful deliberative body in galactic history signed documents that transferred, in stages, the administrative functions of 11 sector governance bodies to a chartered corporate entity registered under commercial law in New York, Sol System, Earth. The final peace summit was held in a human-built facility on what had formerly been Council Prime's administrative district. The facility had been constructed in 31 days. It was functional, efficient, and slightly louder than the glass spire had been. The ventilation system ran at pressure comfortable for humans, a constant low hum that most other species perceived somewhere between background noise and mild dental discomfort. Thorne stood at the head of the table and looked at the assembled representatives of what the new operating documentation called the Human-Led Advisory Board. Some of them had come willingly. Some had come because their travel documentation now required human customs clearance and the alternative was staying home. The distinction did not appear to trouble the agenda. Vex sat 2 seats from the end of the table. He wore, for the first time in his career, a lanyard. It was gray. In 4 languages, human standard font, it said, Junior Compliance Officer. Thorne looked into the broadcast camera with the steady attention of someone who has been preparing a statement for a long time and is not going to rush it now. The broadcast went out on every frequency the Universal Harmony Project had mapped, which was all of them. The Council called us their biggest mistake, a pause measured in heartbeats. We prefer the term unscheduled management acquisition. Welcome to the new peace. The montage ran for 11 minutes across every inhabited system in range. Alien fleets in UNCA colors, safety inspection teams at every jump gate, documentation current, equipment calibrated, former warlords attending mandatory compliance seminars and taking notes. The Kennel's 1,012 ships on open patrol, broadcasting their transponder codes in clear signal, not hiding, not threatening, simply present, the way a wall is present. A cargo freighter at a checkpoint argued with the inspection team about its transit fee. The team lead, a human named Ose, who had been doing this for 3 years and had never lost a negotiation, listened to the full argument. He pulled up the fee schedule. He pointed to the relevant line. The freighter paid the fee. Ose stamped the clearance and waved it through without ceremony. The motion of someone who has done something so many times it has become a kind of rhythm. McCready sent a message to Thorne after the broadcast. 4 words, because McCready had never needed more. The circus worked, boss. Thorne's reply came back in 11 seconds. She was still in the broadcast facility, the timestamp confirmed, presumably watching the montage herself. Peace is a business, and business is booming. Somewhere in the galaxy's outer rim, a navigation buoy drifted along a trade route, its small light blinking at the steady interval of something that does not sleep and does not lose patience. Its automated voice explained to a passing vessel what a safety escort certificate cost and where to file for one. The vessel, after a pause of several seconds, filed. The buoy blinked on. In 12,000 systems, the meter was running.